Past the clouds, over the dark night, she reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Greetings and welcome back as always. Here's some breaking news. Trump plans to replace National Security Advisor Michael Waltz. He's been on thin ice since he organized a group chat on the commercial messaging app Signal to discuss sensitive military operations in Yemen and accidentally included a journalist in the conversation. You know, folks, I wonder if Waltz is the scapegoat to cover other glaring deficiencies in Trump's national security team. He now plans to nominate Waltz as the U.S. ambassador to the UN. And I think Marco Rubio is going to become acting national security advisor as well as Secretary of State. What a mess. Also, Ukraine seems to now have managed to wrangle some more favorable terms out of the United States before signing this long-awaited minerals deal. They signed it yesterday. And I wonder how much of this has more to do with finding an excuse to keep the United States in Ukraine as opposed to just looking for minerals. You know what? There are a lot of other things going on in the world. What's happening? Well, let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they occur in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historic context in which most events take place. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they occur, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that are impacting the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is a Trump-appointed federal judge ruled earlier today that the president exceeded his authority by invoking the Alien Enemies Act to summarily deport Venezuelan migrants. This is dealing a blow to the administration's deportation efforts and permanently barring such removals from South Texas. And to discuss this, my guest has taught international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law since 2012, and he's the author of the book, The Case for Palestine, Why It Matters, Why You Should Care. Professor Dan Kovalik, as always, Dan, welcome back.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
Before we get into this business, Donald Vega, I think, is who you were thinking about. He's the pianist in the Ron Carter Trio.
That's exactly right. You got it.
Okay. Phenomenal pianist. Phenomenal. Okay, now that we've got all that out of the way, so U.S. District Judge Fernando Rodriguez Jr. in Brownsville, Texas, rejected Trump's declarations that the U.S. was being invaded by a Venezuelan gang to justify using the act to deport migrants without a hearing. And I want to read a little bit of his holding because of his opinion, because I think this is very telling. He writes, "The historical record renders clear that Trump's invocation of the act is contrary to the plain, ordinary meaning of the statute's terms. As a result," he wrote, "the administration cannot use it based on the reasoning in the Trump's proclamation to remove immigrants from the country. And he continues, the president cannot summarily declare that a foreign nation or government has threatened or perpetrated an invasion or predatory incursion of the United States, followed by the identification of the alien enemies subject to detention or removal. If you could unpack some of that, Professor Kovalik, but to me, that's an incredibly clear, declarative statement telling Donald Trump he's wrong.
Yes. Well, first of all, the Alien Sedition Act is itself, a questionable law because it really does do an end round of the Constitution, right? So it's been very narrowly interpreted for that reason. Because even aliens, meaning non-U.S. citizens, have certain constitutional rights in the United States if they're in the United States. You know who even said that was Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia, who's a pretty right-wing judge. And even he said they have rights to due process, for example. It may not be a lot of due process, but they can't just be deported, for example, without some sort of hearing in which it's shown that the person is who they claim they are, some sort of threat or whatnot. And in terms of the Alien Sedition Act, it was passed specifically to deal with foreign countries invading the U.S. and trying to protect the homeland. And in this case, we're dealing with a criminal gang, which is not a state, it's not a foreign country, and they haven't really invaded in order to challenge the U.S. government, right? To topple the U.S. government or even to take over the country. They've certainly come to maybe engage in criminal activity, most certainly, but that's not the same thing. And the judge is saying, look, you can only use this under narrow circumstances, and those just don't exist here. And again, you can't just use it summarily. You can't say, oh, hey, you look like you're a Venezuelan gang member, so we're going to just deport you. And not have some sort of due process showing that the person is, in fact, a gang member, right? I think the other problem that Trump has here is under international law, if you're going to deport people, there is a law against refoulement, which means you cannot send people to a place they are likely to be tortured. And of course, sending people to these prisons in El Salvador guarantees they're going to be tortured. These are some of the worst prison conditions in the world. And also, you're supposed to deport people back to their own country, right? So
Right.
If they're Venezuelan, you send them to Venezuela, right? You don't send them to a prison in El Salvador. I mean, again, this is completely insane what Trump is doing. It violates both the U.S. Constitution and international law. And it's great that a judge in Texas, who I'm going to presume would be probably more conservative than, say, a judge.
He's a Trump-appointed judge.
There you go. See, the judges are lining up against Trump because he really is acting in a way clearly against the Constitution. So it's good news. I just hope that Trump abides by that decision. It does seem like in most cases he seems to be abiding by the decisions, but not in all. The worst case is the guy, and I'm forgetting his name, but the guy who was deported to El Salvador, and they said,
Garcia.
oops. Huh?
Armando Garcia.
Yeah, a guy who's been here for a long time. He actually had a immigration judge order saying he can stay here because of dangers of being returned to El Salvador, where he could be tortured by gangs. He was afraid of gangs there. And in spite of that, and in spite of the fact the Trump administration admitted that they sent him to the El Salvador prison by mistake, and despite the fact that the Supreme Court, in a 9-0 opinion, meaning 3 of the justices Trump appointed voted against him, they said he needs to be brought back, and Trump has said, we're not bringing him back. So that's a case where he's not following the law. So I hope he follows the law here.
Robert Brown, thank you very much for that super sticker. Really appreciate it. Dan, talk a bit about when presidents appoint judges, they have a tendency to appoint judges that they believe have a similar philosophical outlook or approach to the law that the president wants protected or furthered or promoted. But there have been instances, and this seems to be more on the conservative side than on the liberal side, that particularly when you get on the federal side in Superior Court and the Supreme Court, they tend to reflect back upon what they learned in law school. And I know this isn't across the board, because the Federalist Society and how they cull the herd, so to speak, but they'll, with the exception of Alito and Thomas, it seems as though they'll only go so far. Because who would have thought that Coney Barrett and Kavanaugh would be siding with Roberts as they have been of late?
Yeah, well, as you say, historically, you couldn't count on nominating certain people to the bench, again, particularly conservatives, and expecting them to necessarily stay.
And Earl Warren is the perfect example of that. When Eisenhower nominated the former Republican governor of California, Earl Warren, that's how you wound up with the Brown decision.
Right. Well, and this is why I know a lot of people want term limits for justices, age limits, or whatever. But this is why lifetime appointments can be good, because in the end, they vote their own consciences in what they think the law really is. They don't have to kiss up to the man anymore, right? I was appointed by Trump, but he can't get rid of me, so I can do what I want. So there is some benefit to that. I think two justices are human. I think they can be swayed by changes in the times. So is it a coincidence that the Brown versus Board decision came down during the Civil Rights Movement? No. There was historical momentum for that decision. Well, and of course you had Thurgood Marshall, a great lawyer, African-American lawyer, who strategically brought that case, right? And he would later become a Supreme Court justice. But all those things were working together. So
yeah, but the story is that if Vinson had not died, and Vinson was the Chief Justice that heard the case, and he died during the summer while the court was in recess, and Eisenhower appointed Warren. In fact, the story is that Eisenhower even had Warren to the White House. I'm not sure it was for dinner or for whatever it was, and said to Warren, look, these Southern people, they aren't really that bad. They're pretty good people. They just don't want their poor little white daughters sitting in classrooms next to big black brutes. You understand, Earl, don't you? And then the story is Warren, over the summer, lobbied the rest of the court, because the court was not going to hold in favor of Brown. They were going to go the other way. And I don't remember which justice it was that said, the death of Fred Vinson shows us there is a God. But anyway, that's the story behind that I understood behind Earl Warren and the Brown, and Eisenhower was not happy.
Yeah. Well, and again, it shows too that they're humans. They can actually be persuaded by their fellow justices. And the justices tend to get along with each other, even if they have different ideological opinions. So all these things are pretty fluid. And again, I think what could happen is Trump could turn these justices more liberal, because they're going to react to him. A lot of his base, even outspoken supporters of him, are now opposing him. They're not happy with this crackdown that he's engaged in. And so he can't count on these judges, because in the end, I do think, and if the system works the way it should, the court should be a backstop against
Right.
executive overreach. And I
Right.
hope, and we are seeing that they are playing that role. And, the system seems to, at least to some degree, be working, again, as long as Trump decides to abide by those decisions. Because in the end, if he doesn't, they can't make him, right? I mean, they don't have much power to make him do it. So, but we'll see. I mean, I think the thing that's also going to get Trump to abide by the decisions is that his poll numbers at the 100-day mark are anemic. I think the worst in 80 years, and even worse than his first term in office. So he knows what he's doing isn't popular. The judges don't like it, and the people don't like it. So, and it looks bad internationally. I mean, we look like we're running a gulag in El Salvador, which, by the way, we are.
We are.
Yeah, only because we happen to be. So.
O.L. Griffin, too much is made of Brown v. Board. I don't know what to make of that other than to ask you two questions. One, I wonder how old you are. And I ask that with all due respect, because I'm wondering if your analysis is more of a generational analysis as opposed, I mean, if you're old like me, then I'll be more inclined to take you to task than if you're young like my students. But I'd like for you to elaborate, if you could, on why you believe too much is made of Brown. But with that being said, we will. Oh, so when you read, I don't read nearly as many opinions as you do. So that's why, Dan, I'm turning to you with this question. As I read the language, not only in this opinion, but in a number of others, particularly those that have been coming from judges or justices that were appointed by Democrats, particularly the lower court, their language it's as though the lower court judges are sending messages to the Supreme Court that for you to overturn this, you're going to have to just be a total idiot, and it will be as though you didn't even go to law school, because the issues here are so obvious that a chimpanzee could figure this out. Are you gleaning some of that same, I don't know if it's victory?
I think so. I mean, but I think the main message is to Trump. I do think it's telling him, look, man, you're off base. You're way off base here.
Okay.
What you're doing is illegal, and we're not going to let you do it. And stop doing this. But I think it may work the other way. I think they're taking their cue a little from the Supreme Court, who is making it clear they don't like it either. So, we're in the 21st century, and I think that, we do stand on a bit of a precipice in terms of, is America going to be a free country or is it not? And is it going to be a country with the rule of law or is it not? And I think these judges are realizing they have to really put a line in the sand here. So.
O.L. Griffin, stop it, Doc. Too much is made of Brown and local school districts to begin desegregating public schools. This phrase was intentionally vague. Well, actually, the phrase was with all deliberate speed. And we understand that the court was not nearly as direct as it should have been with demanding or setting a time frame for schools to be desegregated. So it's one thing to say the case didn't go as far as it should have gone. It's another thing to say that too much has been made of the case because so much civil rights legislation that came subsequent to Brown was based on Brown. So O.L. Griffin, I'll have to take exception. We'll have to agree to disagree on that point. Professor Dan Kovalik, if you want to weigh in on that, sir, please do, because you know a hell of a lot more about this than I do.
Yeah, well, no, I just think that it was a landmark decision. It overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which was a long-standing law which allowed this separate but equal system, the Jim Crow system, to exist in the South. And again, it came about not only through protest of this, of the very brave people of the civil rights movement, but all the civil rights legislation and I think decisions also, and we know this from some of the legislative history, came about because the U.S. was embarrassed in the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
In the Soviet Union, they were showing on TV every night African Americans being beat up and having dogs sicked on them, right? And they decided we're going to lose the Cold War over this. We have to, America better look like America a little bit. So, so I do think some very, important landmark decisions like Brown came out of that. And I think we see the world's become more reactionary since that time. And we see that reflected in the courts. But again, we may be turning the corner again. I think that Trump is going to create a backlash, a progressive backlash. I mean, that's what I'm certainly hoping here.
And there's one other thing about Brown, which in fact, I was just, and this is no hyperbole or lie. I was just talking to my students about this yesterday and explaining to them that you can't, I wasn't speaking specifically in the context of Brown, but what I was explaining to them was we were talking about protesting and the impact of protesting today. And I said to them, what you have to understand is during the civil rights movement, that protest was one prong of three approaches that were used together to bring about change. There was protest in the street. There was legislation that was proposed, that the protests in the street were usually were movements to support the legislation. And then there was also the judicial activism. And those three things worked together to bring about change. And that one of the problems that we see today is that a lot of the protest that takes place isn't tied to anything legislative. And so you protest and then you go home and there's nothing else to do, because there's no court decision you're trying to support. There's no legislation you're trying to support. You're out there raising hell for a good cause, but you're just raising hell.
Yeah, well, it's true. And again, if you focus on, for example, the judicial activism you're talking about, these cases were being set up for years by people like Thurgood Marshall. These
Correct.
weren't like an accident, or, they were creating conditions and situations that would allow these things to be brought to the Supreme Court. Everyone thinks
that Brown was a single case and that it came out of nowhere.
Yeah, it came out of nowhere. Everyone thinks Rosa Parks was just tired and that's why she sat in the front of the bus. No, she was part of a movement. She knew what she was doing. And it was
Claudette Colvin who did it before Rosa Parks, but at the time, Ms. Colvin wasn't the image that they were looking for to carry the issue forward, because she was young and pregnant and unwed. There was strategy here.
There was strategy. Everyone was talking to each other. The lawyers were talking to the activists. Activists were talking to the legislators. That's why they won, right? And as you say, and I believe in protest, but as you say, when it's not connected to anything,
correct,
then it's kind of like, you know, a whisper in the air. It just dissipates. And especially when, in my view, when you have these protests that I'm seeing now, where they protest over 50 issues at a time. You're right. Everyone has their own banner, you know, abortion now and this and that. And I'm all for that stuff. But you ain't going to get it unless you focus on one or two issues. You can't have 50 issues that you're protesting for, literally a laundry list, and think it's going to be effective, right? There needs to be a strategy. Like, okay, we're going to focus on immigration rights. We're going to focus on reproductive rights. We're going to, you know, whatever that's going to be. We're going to focus on anti-war. Those are the banners you raise, and those are the things you push. You can't just feel like if you go out on the streets, and again, everyone has their own sign that says something different, that it's going to be effective. It's not, you know.
In fact, two things. One, imagine where we'd be if the Democrats had put forth legislation banning the United States support of genocide in Gaza, and there were protests in the street to get that legislation passed. Now you'd have an entirely different dynamic, I believe, than just pro-Palestinian protesters out in the street protesting the genocide in Gaza.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, you know, that's a tough truth, but it is a truth. And it's a shame that we didn't have that support from the Congress.
In fact, because the Democrats support it.
Yes. And even many of the so-called progressive ones. And they, you know, they will be, you know, someday they'll have to reckon with that. But no, it's absolutely true. But again, I think with the Palestinian protests, I don't think they were in vain, and I think they're still important. Right. But I agree, they could have been more and could still be more effective.
And final point on Brown, because I like you, I teach this. People don't understand. I always go off on this point that people have to understand the brilliance and the strategy. They worked on this for about 12 to 15 years before you got to Brown. There was the Gaines case. There was Sweat v. Texas, where their approach was, well, if Plessy says separate but equal, then we're going to demand equal. And we're going to force these states. If the law says you're not going to let us come to your law school and you have to provide us an equal law school, then we're going to force you to do that because we know you can't afford to do that. And I mean, the way they went about this was brilliant.
Yes. And I would say that, yeah, books will be written about it. Books have been written about it. Oh, many. Yeah, no, it's incredible. Again, you know, there's some great books on Thurgood Marshall, who doesn't get enough credit, for his legal brilliance in all this.
And O.L. Griffin, final point, and then we got to move on. The fact that you can go throughout the South and most of the northern cities and still find segregated schools has nothing to do with Brown, O.L. Griffin. You have to understand housing patterns. You have to, because a lot of your schools tend to be, school populations, excluding busing, tend to be based on housing patterns. So, O.L. Griffin, there's a hell of a lot you got to understand when you want to talk about school segregation in 2025 that has nothing to do with whether or not the Brown case was successful or whether the Brown case is overstated. O.L. Griffin, you need to do some homework on that point. Would you agree with that, Professor Kovalik?
Yeah, and I'll say, we almost may need another Brown, and that is that I think there is a question whether a lot of the segregation is obviously economic, and
True.
a lot of the reason the the poorer districts are not as good as schools is because they're based on property values, property
Correct.
taxes, and so it's not evenly distributed, right? And so the richer, by definitional, who live together have better schools, and
We
I
still
think
have redlining by banks.
right. So there
And
may be some very good cases out there waiting to challenge some of this because it is effective segregation. It's not
right.
it's not legal segregation, it's economic segregation.
And
And
again, you have to look at redlining by banks to see where banks will loan, who banks will lend to, and where they will lend the money. A lot of times that is based on racism. And so there are a whole lot of factors that go into why schools are segregated that have nothing to do with Brown and in no way diminish the significance of that case. We could spend the whole show talking about this, but I think Professor Kovalik, we need to proceed and move on. So I sent you this story for the headline. Fox reports anti-Israel Colombia protester detained by ICE is freed after federal judge's order. Moshe Madawi, an organizer of the and now what I'm reading now comes from not from Fox, but comes from comes from Washington Post. Moshe Madawi, an organizer of the pro-Palestinian movement at Columbia University, was freed from federal custody yesterday, more than 2 weeks after immigration officials detained him and sought to rescind his green card as part of a widening crackdown against against student protesters. I sent you the Fox story, Dan, because they labeled him as an anti-Israel Colombia protester, and every other story I read framed it as a pro-Palestinian protester. And so Fox is just doing what Fox does, using inflammatory language in order to promote the white supremacist settler colony known as Israel. Dan Kovalik.
yeah, well, that's obviously true. I mean that, and that's how this is being phrased in general by the mainstream media. They try to make somehow portray people who are protesting for Palestine, even if they're Palestinians, by the way, as being against Jews, being against Israel, being anti-Semitic, when in fact that's not true, But that's how they're trying to couch this because frankly they're losing this battle. They're losing this ideological war. They've lost the debate. Israel's lost the debate.
Correct.
So they have to slander people essentially and repress them to try now to win through violence instead of through debate, because they can't win the debate now. What's happening in Gaza is an abomination. It's an absolute abomination. And to say it is not anti-Semitic, it's just stating a fact. And to punish people for saying that and for acting on that is just completely unacceptable. And that universities have been in on that. Repressing their own students is just shameful.
In fact, Jason, I think it's Professor Jason Stanley at Yale, is leaving Yale and going to some University of Ottawa or somewhere in Canada, and he's a Jewish American, and he makes the point that using Jews in the for the government to use Jews in this manner is itself anti-Semitic, because they're weaponizing Jews as a way to usurp the First Amendment.
Well, right. And in fact, it also ignores the fact many Jews are protesting for Palestine, right?
Correct.
They're not a monolithic group. No group is monolithic. It's racist on its face, right? Because it suggests that, oh, all Jews support Israel. Well, that's not true.
I'd even suggest to you, Professor Kovalik, that the group of monoliths aren't monolithic.
Well, that's right. There you go. There you go. Right. No, it's absolutely true. So, no, and again, but we're winning. Look, the fact they have to do these insane things, deport students just because they write an article in a newspaper, or fire professors, or beat up students who protest, it shows we're winning, right? This is desperation. This is the act of a state in decline, of a state that does not have the consent of the people anymore with regard to these things. And I think that's going to grow.
What about beyond the ridiculous incendiary language used and the biased language? I mean, that's not journalism in any, that's propaganda. I mean, I'm not saying anything, that's no brilliant revelation. I'm just reiterating the obvious, that Fox is engaged in, and they're not unique in this, but on this issue, Fox is engaged in nothing but propaganda and not journalism. But what about, for example, Judge Jeffrey Crawford, who's a Obama appointee? He draws in his decision, he drew parallels between the current political climate and McCarthyism. This is not the first time that the nation has seen chilling action by the government intended to shut down debate, according to Judge Crawford. This was his decision as he released Moshe Madawi on bail.
Yes, this is a new McCarthy period. There's no question about it. The focus is a bit different. The McCarthy period was focused a lot on Hollywood. There's not much focus of that now, but there was also a focus on faculty and academies during the McCarthy period, and that's a big focus now of this anti-Palestinian campaign. Obviously, as you see, I mean, Trump is trying to take over universities, literally take over whole departments, multiple departments at universities, to dictate what they can and can't teach. This is a dangerous moment, just like the McCarthy period was a dangerous moment in U.S. history. And the reason the McCarthy period ended is because Senator McCarthy overreached. He started to go after people in the Eisenhower White House, and Eisenhower's like, hey, okay, that's enough. Enough's enough. So we'll see. But Trump seems to be overreaching very quickly as well.
Yes.
Again, even within his first 100 days, to the point where his poll numbers are suffering. So I hope this will not last. People need to stand their ground. That's the important thing, not be intimidated. And they need to keep protesting.
Trump is losing ground on this issue as well. And with the release of Mr. Madawi, do you now see that other judges will follow the same lead in order the release of those others that have fallen the same plight?
I'm certainly hopeful that will happen. I do. This is how the law works. Judges follow other judges. That's how law is made. And again, the fact that you have a Trump appointee from Texas ruling positively on some of these types of issues, it gives me hope. It gives me hope that, yes, judges will make the right decisions here.
And not only judges, but one of the other failing factors in all of this is Congress. Congress has just sat quietly and idly by. They are not engaging in their constitutionally mandated responsibility of checks and balances, and they're just sitting back and letting Donald Trump do what Donald Trump wants to do. Even the Democrats, to a great degree, have been sitting idly by, thinking it's better to sit back and say nothing and allow this whole thing to implode, as opposed to seizing the moment and standing up for the Constitution and standing up for the country. Your thoughts, Professor Kovalik?
I agree. Not only is that wrong, from a moral point of view, I think it's political suicide.
Suicide. You're absolutely right.
They have a chance to be the good guys here. They have a chance to win back the support of the American people that, frankly, they've squandered over the years by taking Trump on these issues, on things he's doing that are not popular. I mean, even from their own political self-interest, that would be the right thing to do, and they're not doing it. It's quite a shame, Wilmer.
So, what does that say to you about the ideological base of the party elite? Because they've obviously made some ideological calculations that are playing out to be political losers. Gaza, they made an ideological not Semitic, the Zionists. They made an ideological Zionist-based decision to back genocide, as opposed to the moral decision or even the politically smart decision.
They knew going into the November election that their support for genocide may very well cost them the election, and they chose genocide. They chose genocide over winning, and that tells you everything you need to know about the Democratic Party. And the reason they're sitting back now, because they're not that unhappy with what Trump is doing. In fact, he's doing some things that they would do themselves if they could get away with it. And that is the reality. And I hope
such as Dan.
Well, all the deportations. I saw a figure that Trump's 10% down from where Biden was in terms of the number of deportations now. I mean, and still Trump is, has not come close to Obama's record of deporting 3 million people. I mean,
the deporter in chief.
Yeah. They agree on these issues. I mean, it's just that Trump is louder about it.
Yes.
He's more brazen, maybe a little more brutal in the way he does it. But I mean, basically, they all agree on this. And the same thing with Gaza, obviously.
They're arguing in many instances over methodology instead of ideology.
Correct. And by the way, I need to go. I have an interview in Great Britain.
That's right. You sure do.
But I'll just end it with this. I think, one of the best memes that I've ever seen is that meme. It's of a bomber jet bombing another country. And one just says Republicans. The other one says Democrats. But on the Democratic one, it has Black Lives Matter and a pride flag. It's right. It's all just a matter. It's a matter of symbolism. It's a matter of appearances. I always say, the difference between an Obama and a Trump is the difference between Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy, right? And even put those images in your mind, right? The preppy killer and the clown killer. They're both killers. One just looks better than the other. That's it. So I'll end there.
Professor Dan Kovalik, you fit us in. Greatly appreciate it. Always appreciate it. Look forward to having you back.
Thank you, Wilmer. Take
care, my brother. Dan Kovalik, folks, as you all know, he does nothing but bring it all the time. So this Fox thing, again, this anti-Israel Columbia protester, those to me are the very subtle things, and that's where, in my humble opinion, we go from journalism to propaganda, is because when you listen to what the protests are about, in most of the instances, the protests are not about anti-Israel. I can be pro-me and not be anti-you. But the way that the white supremacists that are in the settler colonialists that are trying their best to set the narrative and control the narrative, they always have to put these things in a binary context. You're either here or there, on or off. If you're Donald Trump has said many times, you're either for me or against me. And that's not always true. Again, in fact, look at the narrative now that we're seeing, going back to this point we've been talking about for the last 2 days, in terms of Burkina Faso and General Traoré, and the fact that, in fact, I was having this conversation today with one of my colleagues who said to me that the big problem, one of the big problems with Traoré in Burkina Faso is that he's backed by Russian money. And I said, well, why is the fact that it's Russian money, why is that in and of itself a bad thing? And he said, well, you have to look at the things that Russia does, blah, blah. I said, well, man, how long has Burkina Faso been a French colony? And he said, oh, hundreds of years. I said, and they're one of the poorest countries in the world, under the thumb of France. But Traoré has been in power 18 months, and look at the change that's taken place. Why? I said, why? I said to him, I'm not accusing you of this, but many people, when they hear the word Russia, they immediately go negative. And I said, so the analysis has to actually be analysis. The analysis can't be based on rhetoric. We have to take, I tell my kids this all the time, we're political scientists. You have to take your emotion out of the analysis and deal with the facts. And sometimes that forces you to look favorably upon actions taken by people you may not like. But you can't be just so dismissive because the standard narrative, I said, man, look, what country has done more? Kevin Baptiste, my brother, thank you for that great analysis. Thank you for that compliment. I said, if you understand the history of African revolution, who other than Cuba was supporting African countries during their revolutionary periods, of which we're in a new one now? The Soviet Union. You would not have been able to get rid of apartheid in South Africa if it hadn't been for Russia backing the freedom struggle in Angola. And the colleague I was talking to said, yes, but now what you have is Russia selling weapons to African countries, and those weapon sales have not gone favorably towards the freedom in those countries. I says, well, in many instances, I think the jury is still out on that, because Russia has been doing this in response to American colonial imperialism. So anyway, not to go back to the Traoré and Burkina Faso issue, but that's just an example of how you have to be very, very careful in what you read. You have to be you have to be a very discerning listener, and you have to be a very discerning reader, because again, this propagandist operation that we now call American journalism and media, oh my God, they'll slip some stuff in on you. They'll put a Mickey in your drink in a minute. You'll be walking around totally out of your mind. They'll put a Mickey in your drink in a minute. So now here's another interesting element today, and that is Israel redraws Gaza map, limiting Palestinians to a third of the enclave. Since breaking the ceasefire, Israeli forces have declared about 70% of Gaza either a military, quote unquote, red zone or under evacuation. In the 6 weeks since Israel resumed its war in Gaza, Israeli forces have dramatically altered its map, declaring about 70% of the enclave either a military red zone or under evacuation. This is according to the United Nations, and pushing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into ever shrinking pockets. And folks, they're doing this while at the same time they are literally starving the Palestinians. Starving the Palestinians. I'm going to say that again. Starving the Palestinians. Starving children. Starving women. Starving families. And it's not because of a drought. It's not because of famine. It's not due to some other type of natural cause that is making it impossible to get food, medicine, and aid to these starving people, because the trucks are at the on the border of Egypt, and the Zionist government will not allow the aid into the country. They have made a conscious decision to starve children. For years, they've been managing caloric intake in Gaza. I don't know how many of y'all know that, but for years, they have been managing the amount of food that people are able to consume in the West Bank and in Gaza. Managing caloric intake. And now they've gone from managing caloric intake to flat out starvation. Not only are they bombing hospitals, which is a war crime. There's no debate about that. You can't, Kamala Harris, you can't debate that point. Joe Biden, that's not a point up for debate. That bombing hospitals is a war crime. Starving people is what is called collective punishment. Collective punishment is a war crime. That's not up for debate. You might as well, again, you all hear me love to make the point about, you might as well try to debate with me that 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. Or you might take the position that 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. You might try to convince me the world is flat. Not going to happen. So as Lil Marco, as the Secretary of State, as the chief diplomat in the United States, that's what the Secretary of State is. He's the chief diplomat in the United States, sitting idly by and allowing this government, Kevin Baptiste, thank you so much for that additional super sticker, sitting idly by and watching as the country that he is the chief diplomat of is starving people to death. Your tax dollars, your government, your president, your members of Congress are silent. Democrats as well. Hakeem Jeffries backing murder. Gregory Meeks backing murder, genocide against other people of color. I don't get it. Simone Sanders Townsend, you're on MSNBC, saying nothing. Saying nothing. Michael Steele on MSNBC, saying nothing. While children are starving. It is sickening. It is sickening because this is not a political issue. This is not a political issue. Starvation, intentional starvation of children is not a political issue. It's a moral issue. And these folks claim to be Christians. Claim to be Christians. I kind of joked about this a couple of days ago, but the Jesus that I learned about in the 12 years that I was sentenced to spend in Catholic school, and I did all 12, there was no probation nor parole. Jesus didn't starve people. Mike Huckabee claims to be a Christian, but somehow in his warped mind, the starving of these children will facilitate the return of Jesus? Because that's what these Christian Zionists are promoting, is that they have formed this alliance with the Zionists in Israel because this will expedite the rapture, and the rapture comes and Jesus comes back and the Jews are going to convert to Christianity, and then everybody, really? Mike Huckabee, you can actually sit here and think you can tell me that that makes sense, that follows scripture. I would love, and One Pretty Boy 11, thank you for that super sticker. I would really, Sandra Muhammad, call Mike Huckabee. I know you can call him. Sandra Muhammad, O.L. Griffin, Cherie, call Mike Huckabee and tell him, Kevin back home from Oaktown. Kevin, call Mike Huckabee and get him on the phone, because that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. Starving children is somehow going to expedite the return of Jesus so that I was going to go someplace I rhetorically should not go. Confused people like Mike Huckabee are going to go to heaven. He might as well, you know what? He might as well get in the same suicide mission with the Muslims that believe that blowing stuff up will send you to heaven with 55 virgins and all that other foolishness. Yeah, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna strap on this vest and I'm just gonna have a whole bunch of explosives in it. And because I'm fighting the infidel, I'm gonna go out here and I'm gonna blow up this restaurant. And when I blow up the restaurant, 17 virgins are gonna meet me. And really? That's how it's supposed to work. We criticize those Muslims who believe that gross misinterpretation, and we call them terrorists, and we call them sick. Well, Mike Huckabee, you're just as sick as them. Joe Biden, you're just as sick as them. Donald Trump, well, all I got to say is Donald Trump, and you all can finish the rest of that sentence. What have we come? What has this become? What has this become? Kevin Baptist, call him, Sandra Muhammad, call him. No, Kevin, you call him. Where's Congress? Where's the Congressional Black Caucus? Where's the Congressional Black Caucus? Where is the so-called conscience of the Congress? I'll tell you where they are. They're unconscious. That's where they are. That's where they are. That little gathering that Warnock and what's his name had on the Capitol steps last Sunday, Warnock and Hakeem Jeffries. That little coffee clatch that they had. Why weren't they talking about this? Why weren't they talking about this? The hypocrisy in all of this is nauseating, physically nauseating. Congress is doing nothing. And so we're hearing people are talking about these questions. Oh, look at what Donald Trump is doing. Is Donald Trump taking us into a constitutional crisis? No, he's not. The fact that Congress isn't doing their job of checks and balances, that's what's taking us into the constitutional conflict, crisis. Bank robbers are going to rob banks. That's why they're bank robbers. Bank robbers are going to rob banks. Donald Trump is a bank robber. We know that. We know that. So, are you mad at the bank robber for trying to rob the bank? Or are you angry at the police department that did not respond to the alarm when the bank robber was in the vault, stuffing the bags full of cash? John Dillinger was John Dillinger. Pretty Boy Floyd was Pretty Boy Floyd. That's what they did. When they tell you who they are, believe them. And when they show you who they are, really believe them. Bank robbers are going to rob banks. Donald Trump is a bank robber. Congress is allowing him to do this. He is not taking us into a constitutional crisis. He's doing what he do. It's Congress abdicating its responsibility to defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic. They all stood there and raised their hand and swore an oath to the Constitution to defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic. Donald Trump is a domestic enemy. They are not defending the Constitution against that enemy. That's not his fault. He's playing the game. And he's out on the court committing all kind of fouls, wreaking all kind of havoc. They're the referees. They're the striped shirts. They're not blowing their whistles. They've swallowed their whistles. So you can't blame him. When the mailman comes to your house and your dog tries to bite the mailman, I'm not advocating biting letter carriers. A lot of members of my family worked in the post office. But the point is, the dog is doing what the dog's supposed to do. Because that's what dogs do. They bark at, except mine, they bark at the mailman. My silly dog opens the door and puts the mail on the dog's head, and he just lays there like, okay. Anyway, you can't get mad at the dog. The dog is doing what the dog do. Dog 101. Anybody ever go to dog class? Dog 101. Dog barks at mailman. So they're cutting Pell Grants. I'm going to shift gears here. They're cutting Pell Grants. They're cutting Pell Grants. They're then making it more difficult for people to qualify for Pell Grants. And I think they're raising the interest rate on Pell Grants. And the rationale that you hear from the Trump administration is that taxpayers should not be subsidizing the education that irresponsible people, this is their language, irresponsible people can't afford to go to school. That's coming from a guy that went bankrupt 6 times. You want to talk about irresponsible from a financial perspective. This guy went bankrupt 6 times, bankrupted a damn casino. He broke a machine that was invented to print money. A casino is a machine that was created to print money. He broke a machine invented to create money, went bankrupt. The Taj Mahal in Atlantic City. But now wants to penalize people who want to educate themselves, but don't have the means to do so, and are turning to the government for support in that effort, and calling them irresponsible and saying taxpayers should not have to cover their interests, when this dude filed bankruptcy 6 times. And so what does that do? That means that his debtors can't collect full dollar for dollar on their debt. Somebody covered his debt. He got his debt covered behind foolishness and stupidity. These folks are going into debt to try to better their life circumstances. And he wants to, and why is it that they have to use such nasty language, such inflammatory language when they talk about people? Why irresponsible people who can't afford, we cannot cut their student loan obligations because they're reckless, irresponsible people? Why is it so visceral? What does this become? Well, Dr. Nick, some of your best friends are letter carriers, as some of my favorite members of my family were letter carriers. But again, final point, you can't put this in a binary context. I wrote a piece back, I think it was 23, the dangers of binary thinking for the African American community, because the Democrats are just as, if not more, complicit in the crime. They're just as complicit, if not more so, in the crime. So this isn't an anti-Trump diatribe or tirade. He's just part of the sickness. So that's about what I got for today. That's about what I got for today for y'all. So, Brother Dan Kovalik, as always, man, thank you. Greatly, greatly appreciate it. Thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon, and folks, really need y'all to, I think we're almost to 7,000 subscribers on YouTube, and we're trying to get to 10. We're approaching that, but we got it. We need to hit that mark, and really need you all to subscribe if you can. Again, $4.99 a month will you have no idea. That's one, latte frappe with soy milk, with chai and a little cinnamon, shaken up and consumed upside down. It's just one of those. A week or a month, if you could sacrifice one of those a month and help us we would greatly, greatly appreciate it. And again, no tariffs on this. This is tariff free. So think about the value. Oh, wait a minute. Before I go, final point on the tariff thing. So it was rumored that Amazon was going to put on their website, next to the items that were subjected to tariffs, that Amazon was going to put what the tariff cost would be. And the Trump administration called Jeff Bezos and said, pump your brakes, partner. No, homie, you can't do that. No, don't do that. And so then Jeff Bezos comes out with a statement. Oh, well, we weren't going to do it anyway. We really weren't going to do it. Psych. We weren't going to do it. 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 So here's my question. Donald Trump, you told us that the tariffs were a wonderful thing. Think back, folks. See, I'm old enough to remember yesterday. I'm old enough to remember yesterday. I'm old enough to remember last week when Donald Trump told us the tariffs were beautiful. That's his language. The tariffs were a beautiful thing. Donald, if the tariffs are so beautiful, then why don't you want people to see them? Why did you call Jeff Bezos with your pants on fire? Because the rumor was he was going to show on Amazon why your prices are going up due to the tariffs. Am I wrong for asking that question? Cherie, tell me. Tell me. Isaac T. Studio, tell me, am I wrong? Kevin Baptiste, am I wrong? Even Zayun, am I wrong? If the tariffs are such a beautiful thing and they're going to return all of this manufacturing back to the United States, and it's going to make the country, all of this money is going to pour back into the treasury, as Donald Trump told us it would. Why don't you want American people? Cherie, oh, I'm not. Well, thank you. Why doesn't Donald Trump want you to see the tariffs? I don't know the answer to that question, but the answer could be because he's lying to you. Could be. Oh, thank you. Because it's a lie. Okay. Question answered. As they would say in court, question asked, question answered. With that, we'll move on. Careful that Dr. Women. No, see, he told me I'm right. All right. We got that. I've been wanting to ask that question, and I just remembered to answer that question. Rample Sense, hey, my pleasure. This is what I do. And I got to thank Nico House. First of all, I thought that was a phenomenal conversation. It wasn't an interview, it was a conversation. And the compliments that he paid to me and paid to Garland, I never thought that I would be considered an OG in this platform. But big ups and big love to Nico for that. Dr. Nick, epic show yesterday. Thank you. I appreciate that. soy products are bad for the health. And, you know, Donald Trump is decimating those American soy farmers because they can't, something like 60 or 70% of American produced soybeans were sent to China. And now China isn't taking American soybeans. And Donald Trump sits there and tries to tell you, oh, well, they'll fold. No, they went to Brazil. They're getting their soybeans from Brazil. They found another supplier. And trust me, if you drop the tariffs tomorrow, a lot of that soy business is not going back to China. It's a scam. It's a sham and a flim flam. You can quote me on that. All right. Tomorrow is Professor Richard Wolff. He's going to join us tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be, as the Moon Man would say, it's going to be a big one. So with that, please follow and subscribe, leave a review, share the show, follow us on social media. All the links are below. Remember, this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter. And folks, we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. This is rhetoric-free podcasting. See y'all tomorrow. Professor Richard Wolff will join us. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a blessed and wonderful remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.